Good morning. I'll go around and stuff. This is a follow-on where my granddaughter, oldest grandchild, is writing a report on what it was like in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s in America. And I was tasked to provide some input on it, having lived through it in America. And the first thing that I need to highlight is she said she's broken it up into periods: 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 80s, so on. First of all, the period of breaking is an artificial. Years don't just change. Things don't just change when the calendar has changed from 1969 to 70, or from 1979 to 80. The changes have been gradual all the way along the line, and so uh, that's the first aspect. They bleed together. You can't just artificially chop a section. So what I'm going to do is sort of pick up where I left off in the 1960s, because it's going to bleed into the 1970s. And the same thing happens in the 1980s. It bleeds from the 1970s into the 1980s. There's no distinctive period. You can do a sliding scale if you want. Pick a 5-year period. That may be a better way to look at it, because so much goes on, and it is not strictly on a boundary, such as 1970 and 1980. Okay? The other factor, of course, is the view that I'm going to provide. Is based on my age at the time, and I can no longer, because I was in early 1970s, 22, 23 years old. My life would have been as different than someone who had been born in that year, and what they saw and impacted and so on. So all I can do is provide some perspective on that. But as I tried to in the previous episodes, um, highlight the factors that involved everyone in the United States. And factors which involved everyone include everything from environmental to political, what was going on in the around you, environmental, the city you were in, things that were happening at that level, whether you had moved or not, and the political continued is a big factor in the United States. The federal government, the way our United States is organized, we have a federal government and we have state governments, and something similar like that throughout the world, but the amount of influence that the federal government has over the states, or in other countries like communist China, how much influence the central government has over provinces or prefects or whatever they're called. Same way with Japan, same way with most companies. You have various layers of authorities, from the city to the state to the federal government or a central government. And on top of that, you have usually a central bank. It's interesting, when a country comes into existence, one of the first things they do is establish what's called the central bank. And the bank then it tries to control the economy from one perspective in terms of interest rates. The central bank lends money, if you will, to banks. It also, through other mechanisms, controls how banks operate, what they must hold in the way of actual cash reserves, how much they can lend out, those sorts of things. That's all intermixed and involved, because one of the things that affects America is the interest rate that is out there for everything from borrowing money to buy a car, to borrowing money to buy a house, or interest rates on credit cards, which were not always in America, but central economics and political, always a part of the American landscape, and it affected every individual, no matter where you lived and what you were doing for a living, or if you were in college or whatever. Okay, so I'm going to pick up on them. I didn't cover much of the mid to late 1969s period, or 1960s period, which bleeds, of course, into 1970. Again, no concrete, real visible barrier between 1969 and 70. It just doesn't exist. 1 year it had a different number on it, but it was still a continuation of what had happened before. It doesn't work that way. It flows in a continuum. Okay, I'm going to go back to like the mid 1960s, sometime in there, because it really does influence what comes after. And the mid 60s, as I recollect it, here's some important information. Kennedy had been elected president in 1962, took office in 1963. He's the one who authorized advisors in Vietnam. Again, we were headed expanding to the west. The Chinese they're spreading their communism in those countries in the Pacific, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. And the two collided there. And we sent advisors in to help the Vietnamese army. We had an agreement with Vietnam, a defense pact, if you will. And so if they got attacked, we would support them. I don't think it was a point of attack, but it was an agreement of support. So we sent advisors in, and we started sending equipment in. And Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and his vice president took over, who was Johnson, a old Democrat from the state of Texas. And he was a hardliner, and he had kept most of the administration that Kennedy put in place. And Kennedy was a Harvard or Yale or whatever it was guy. And he stocked his cabinet with Harvard and Yale intellectual guys. That was one of the things he did. And they took a stance that we really had to fight communism, the expansion of Chinese communism. So thus, all our support for Vietnam. When Johnson took over, he served out the term that had been left of Kennedy. He served the rest of that term, and that was in the early 60s. And the people that were around him at the time saw what was going in Vietnam, and our supplying of advisors really wasn't cutting it. And so we started sending actual American troops to Vietnam during that period of late 66, 67. We started ramping up our presence. We shipped our aircraft there, all of our big military tools, tanks, and lots of men. And besides the Vietnam buildup, which occurred under Johnson, and keep in mind, it's real important, up till Vietnam, the Americans, when they were involved in a global conflict of some kind, had never lost a war. It was a very clear win. And we had, North Korea, we were part of the UN forces in the 50s. And with the UN, we managed to drive North Korea back across whatever parallel it was. And there was never a actual peace agreement, but there was a ceasefire. And wherever you were at the time, whatever you occupied, that became the new boundary. So we still had North Korea and South Korea. we had troops in Korea, South Korea, and we still do today. But we had been, if you call, victorious. We declared that a victory because we drove them back up north, and the South was free of conflict again. World War II, we were obviously a victor. There can be some argument about that. The Russians really had more. They were involved more in the defeat of the Germans than the United States was, in a sense. And the people will argue that, but the Russians really were the ones who they just wore down the Germans because of. Anyway, now in the 60s, you have the assassination of Kennedy. Johnson takes over. He ramps up, and he's, again, an old Democrat. He ramps up the war in Vietnam, but he also does some other things. The civil rights movement started in the 1960s, Martin Luther King and others. There had been finally a breakout of enough of this racial discrimination, the segregation of schools, the overrights of black people, not allowed to do this, not allowed to do that. And King, in his wisdom, really proposed a nonviolent way to try to get the government or our governments to change their policies related to the civil rights. Yes, black men had been able to vote. I think sometime after the Civil War, that had happened. And of course, the blacks had become free people after the Civil War. But Southern segregation was still really strong. So one of the things Johnson did was he enacted the Civil Rights Act, which made discrimination based on race illegal in the United States. You couldn't not hire someone because they were black. You couldn't not sell a house to a black because they were black, a person because they were black. And that was all true to most, all the way up to the mid-1960s. And then with Johnson coming in, and he was a very liberal, if you call, Democrat, liberal being, he was trying to do he was trying to help the social stratus of the United States, the people of the United States. So he enacted the Civil Rights Movement, and during his term, and I was in high school at the time, and I was on a debate team, I think, in 1964, 1963, 1964, and the topic of debate was whether the United States should provide health care for seniors and also for folks who could not, the lowest economic levels, provide health care to the lowest economic levels. And Johnson, with control of the House of Representatives and the Senate, I think both at the time, was able to get legislation through which came up with Medicare and Medicaid. That got established during Johnson in, I don't know, somewhere in the mid-60s. That came into being, Medicare, Medicaid. Social Security had been around since the 1930s or 40s. That had been established, but health care for seniors subsidized by a new law, legislation of taxes. That's when taxes started. Add-on to income taxes was FICA taxes. It was insurance to pay for health care for seniors, also for, I don't think it included Medicaid, but it was for health care for seniors. Okay, so the war is going on, and Johnson is a staunch believer we must defeat them. So the draft starts, and in mid-60s, so he starts drafting, and we ramp up a huge military presence in Vietnam. I think overall there were like 3 million American men who served at one time or another during the Vietnam era or the Vietnam War. Johnson, and there's a big fracture here, and that's what needs to be highlighted out. Johnson and all his people would stand up and give addresses, public speeches. We are winning the war. We can show the body count of how many Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong, actual people living in Vietnam who supported the overthrow of the democratic government in South and replace it with a communist one. Okay, so um, he kept coming up on the television saying we're winning the war and we just need more troops. General Westmoreland is head of all of it. We need more troops. We need more equipment. So we did. We shipped in. And part of the issue was that North Vietnam had been supplying the Viet Cong, or the people living in Vietnam who were just everyday people who supported the cause of communism. And they were fighting and taking over villages and doing all sorts of things. Uh, uh, we ramped up a lot, and we actually started bombing campaigns in North Vietnam, and also hitting all the supply routes coming down from North Vietnam into the south. And that's when we started using various pesticides, Agent Orange, to kill vegetation so we could clearly see them. We did not have a lot of satellites up at the time. It wasn't like that. Okay, so I'm going to try to... Vietnam, because it was a draft, people were drafted from every walk of life, from every part of the country, shipped off to Vietnam, and lots were, every town had caskets coming home of dead soldiers. Okay, it was, the government might say we were winning and all, but there was a lot of death. Everybody was touched one way or the other. I think just about everybody knew someone who had lost a son to Vietnam, and so there was a resistance had begun about the war. This wasn't like World War II, where it was a very clear evil, and Germany had swept into other countries and done all sorts of atrocities. This wasn't like that. This was more of a political ideology war than it was where you have, like World War II, very clear evil in Germany and Japan, and they had to be defeated, and we did. We defeated them. Ramped up the draft, and it's just bad news. The government, this is where there's a major fracture. I need to make a point here. The government is telling you a rosy story about things when it's very clear from what's happening. The economy is moving, we're supplying weapons, but we're piling up a lot of American dead. And everybody's saying, we're not at war with anybody. Nobody attacked us. The Vietnamese didn't invade California. It's a little different. It's not quite as concrete as World War II in terms of everybody understanding why we're there. Okay, so protests began. The civil rights movement. Yes, Johnson had done that, and that had cooled a little bit, but there were still riots in the late 60s in most major cities. Cities were burned under primarily black sections of the city. I never quite understood why they burned their portions of the city, but they did. Okay, so Johnson, he does a lot of good stuff. But he comes on television and basically paints such a rosy picture of everything. And it's just not true. More troops are sent. We bomb Laos, Cambodia. Eventually, protests began in the late 60s to the whole Vietnam War issue. And there were big protests. And like always, there was university protests. Big university protests. And Johnson who had been reelected. He served out Kennedy's term, and then he'd been reelected and reelected again. And because the Constitution, he was actually, he served out Kennedy's, rest of Kennedy's term, and then he'd been reelected. That's what it was. And when it came up for the next election, he was allowed to run for president. That would give him 2 consecutive terms, which is the limit, but he had been allowed because he finished off one term. Things were bad. The war was not going well. There was a lot of dissent from a racial point of view, from a political point of view. What are we doing in Vietnam? On a racial point of view, I don't know, some percentage, 50%, 60% of soldiers in Vietnam were black. We were drafting low-income men. You could get a college deferment if you were going to college. You didn't have to get drafted. And there were other deferments if you were involved in a defense industry of some kind. You didn't have to get drafted. So what happened was we were drafting lower income people who didn't have a way to get out of it. And the troops in Vietnam, there was a high percentage of poor black people. Okay, so that continued to stir up the unrest. In the late 60s, there were a lot of unrest, and it started in various places. There were major riots and revolts and protests in Washington, D.C. And in California, the culture began to fracture. It had been monolithic. After World War II, for a long time, America was homogenized and that everybody was sort of in the same socio-economic status. And that continued for a long time. And the civil rights had been quiet. The blacks knew their place because of segregation. And it was fairly stable from that perspective. There weren't really super rich people. There weren't super poor people. But anyway, but in the late 60s, with the draft people being sent over there, and the economics that had occurred, there was a schism, there was a break. Hippies came into being in the late 60s. And this started in California, where men grew their hair long, and it was fracturing of that monolithic socioeconomic situation where everybody was more or less the same. Everybody sort of believed in the federal government and what they were doing. They had their jobs, families were being raised, the economy had been okay, houses were being built, and so on and so on. But there was a fracturing, and it's like it started off with, okay, now you got these hippies, you got people, men wearing long hair, and marijuana or drugs appeared in the scene. Had not been there. It was been there all along, but it became real popular. So you got a hippie culture starting, which is a counterculture to what had been. That is a monolithic, everybody in the same socio-economic sort of situation. And over the 60s, wealth had begun to become more common, and that the wage gap and wealth between multiple classes formed. They had always been there, but there were more and more people in upper class economically and politically and socially. So in the late 60s, with the Vietnam going on and the civil rights movement, there was a fracturing of the culture. And one of the things that came out of the late 60s, which was real important for all the protests about this and that, there was awareness started about, in the late 60s and early 70s, air pollution was extremely bad. There were days that in the summer in any place, the air was not fit to breathe. We had no environmental protection agency at that time. There was not a lot of care about water quality or purity. That all became the cause for some of this revolting that was going on. There were hippies or counterculture people waving flags in the late 60s saying we got to take better care of our water. We got to do something about this pollution. There's days you just can't breathe outside. So the establishment of the EPA and water quality, and I told you civil rights, all began to take effect in the late 60s and bled in the 1970s. That's why things bleed over. One thing affected another. That was one of the best things that happened out of the late 1960s and starting 1970s was the establishment of cabinet-level Environmental Protection Agency and the water quality issue, more about the environmental of the physical United States of America. Okay, so the war's been going on. We're still losing mass people. People are still standing up and saying we're winning the war. Everybody's saying that's not true. Okay, so Johnson, he could run for another term, but decided he was so unpopular. The war had caused so many deaths. He would come out and say things. He was basically lying. Another thing that fractured in the late 60s and early 70s for a lot of people was loss of faith in the credibility of the U.S. government. Up till that time, after World War II, the federal government had led us successfully through World War II and post-World War II. The interstate system, houses being built, so on and so on. Life was good, if not a struggle still, but it was good. And the federal government was taking care of us like they should, and whatever they said, most people believed. They said we need to do this, well, yeah, okay, so if you need to do that, yeah, okay. The late 60s, because of Vietnam and somehow a war that's way over there, and we're told we got to do it for political reasons. I mean, they never invaded us. They never bombed us. They didn't do a Pearl Harbor on us or anything. It fractured. And it became clear the United States doesn't always tell the truth. The federal government doesn't always tell the truth. And not only did the culture fracture, but there was some loss of credibility as to the federal government and exactly I, for one, could no longer simply believe what the federal government told me. I don't care what it was. And the problem with trust is if there's ever a perception of wrongdoing, it can destroy trust. And that's what happened. There was a perception of wrongdoing having to do with the war. We were winning, but no, we were not. And there was going to be a light at the end of the tunnel. They could see it. Things were going to get better. No. There was no light at the end of the tunnel. Things got worse. Okay. Johnson didn't run for re-election. And Richard Nixon, who had he'd been back, he'd been polished all along. He ran against the replacement for Johnson. I'm trying to think of this. Okay. So Nixon won the 1970 election, a Republican. We went from Democratic Johnson, and there was partly a backlash to Johnson, not only because of the war, but also of all his social reform business. People in Iowa don't have any use for the federal government. Now we're going to take care of seniors, which is okay, but they've added a tax. Now I, at the age of 23, have got to be paying money out of my paycheck to support some old geezer someplace. When you futz with taxes, nobody likes it. Nobody wants a new tax or a higher tax. Again, a fracturing in the late 60s and early 70s. Nixon takes over. For a while, he's more of the same. We are going to win in Vietnam. He did have some bright people. He changed the administration under him, and he brought in Henry Kissinger, which was a statesman. And one of the things that Nixon did was he made an effort to try to establish better relationships with China. China, again, had been politically influencing and sending down into Laos and Cambodia, and that was part of the issue. But the other issue, China had been real isolated. They had not been a major player in the world from any particular perspective, because Mao Zedong had controlled China and it was sort of isolated. They were just taking care of their own people and whipping their people into shape. Nixon made an effort to go to China and try to open it up. And part of the philosophical economic policy at the time was that world trade, there'd always been world trade, but that world trade would benefit everybody. That was the economic theory that became to come alive at that period. So all these other countries like China had lots and lots of labor, lots and lots of people in China. And what they were getting paid on a day, I mean, the average, like it cost $2 a day to live in China. That bought your food and some kind of shelter. Very cheap labor. So if we could get the Chinese to provide some of their labor to build some of the products that we consume in the United States, it was considered a good idea. So Nixon established, he actually physically went to China and got the communist government there. Now, Mao had died at that point, and there was a new government in place, and they saw that central control of everything doesn't really work very well. The Russians had just found the same thing out, and they also, in the 70s, began to open up a little bit and allow free enterprise, where you could establish a company and build and sell products. The government no longer dictated how many shoes had to be made each year and where they were sent. They were allowing companies to come out of, people grouped together, start a company, build a better product, and sell it to their own people as well as export it. So there was an attempt made from an economics point of view. World trade's a good idea, so we'll see. That's where it started, and with the liberalization in China of the centralized government to allow some free enterprise in China, that's when China became a major trading party. That had started in the 70s, and an important attribute, okay? Okay, Nixon becomes president. He continues the same old story. But I think in one of his terms, in the second term, at the beginning of the second term, he had promised we're going to shut down the Vietnam War. We will declare victory. We're declaring victory. And that South Vietnam can defend itself. We have now trained enough. They've got enough equipment. We don't need to be there anymore. They can take care of their own. They'll be able to keep South Vietnam, South Vietnam. So in 1972, we withdrew the last of our troops out of, I think in that era, we'd been moving down the number of troops we had there, and we took all our, I think 72, something like that. Well, it took about 2 years. I think the wind down started in 70, and in 1972 or thereabouts, the last American troops were pulled out because the North Vietnamese had started a major offensive. It took 2 years for the South Vietnamese to fall to the communist hands after we withdrew our troops. Okay, so in the early 70s, we've got this disgruntled people, and they're disgruntled about civil rights. They're disgruntled about the federal government, how they've been lying to us about this draft business. We got lots of dead people. We got, big turmoil period. A fracturing of the American monolithic socioeconomic conditions, what it had existed from the end of World War II up till 1970. It fractured right there. Now you have subcultures. That's the period of Charlie Manson and the crazy people in China and California, and Charlie Manson wanted to start race riots. That was his whole idea. He wanted war, black and white to go to war, and there was some concern that would happen. Okay, um, Nixon is a Republican, and he does Republican stuff. And again, he takes more of a world stage point of view with Kissinger opening up China. But Nixon is, they're all those guys are really old politicians. They've been in politics their whole life, probably done nothing other than politics their whole life. And he's paranoid. He's been paranoid his whole life, apparently. So he winds up organizing and authorizing a break-in to the Democratic National Convention or some Democratic Party headquarters at Watergate. That gets, the media gets attention. It blows up in a newspaper article. Nixon winds up having to resign because he's going to be impeached. Very clear he committed a criminal act. His vice president is Gerald Ford. Nixon resigns, Gerald Ford takes over. And for the good of the country, which is a common thing, and I'll highlight this, all major institutions, Catholic Church to Boy Scouts to anything, a large groups of people, there is in the hierarchy of the organization, when wrongdoing is found by your leaders, for the good of the institution, you can't really make it public because you'll lose trust in the institution. The Catholic Church hid for years the abuse by their priests, and one of the drivers was that, yes, it was wrong, but if we tell everybody about it, they will lose credibility in the eyes of the people. So for the good of the institution, we're not going to expose our bad priests. We'll take them out of service and send them over here for education or training, or we'll just shift them to another parish and tell them not to do it again. With the federal government, all the lying and all the stuff that gone on during Vietnam, and then Nixon doing criminal acts, Gerald Ford inherited a mess. First thing he did was pardon Nixon, a very controversial aspect of the early 70s, but he did it for the good of the country. Yes, he was a criminal, he did bad things, but for the good of the federal government's credibility, which to me it was already gone. And if you go talk to a person in Iowa, Montana, Kansas, it had already gone. And credibility of the federal government, they don't do anything right. They screw up everything. All they do is tell me what to do, and they don't. And all they do is collect more taxes from me. Okay, so Ford takes over from Nixon. He pardons him. Well, that didn't sit very well with a lot of people. So Ford runs for election, and 1970, whatever it was, 6. And the Democrats, they haven't been in power since Johnson now. And it's a strange, bizarre thing. But Jimmy Carter, who was a governor of whatever southern state it was, I forget, Arkansas maybe, I don't know, I forget. Anyway, he gets elected, and he's a Democrat. And so now we're going to shift over back to taking care of our people and liberal stuff. Well, one of the things he decided was that America needs to become energy independent. We had lots of oil in the United States, and but we had also been importing lots of oil from the Persian Gulf, from Saudi Arabia and so on. Everybody had been buying cars after post-World War II, and the energy demand had required, so we were bringing in oil to burn and that sort of stuff. So he decided, and again, so we needed, just like somebody right now is saying we need to be green, Carter was saying we need to be oil independent. So he started the establishment of trying to promote oil production, more oil production in the United States. And the Saudis and the Persian Gulf area, they had formed together in a conglomerate and said, instead of you just selling your oil for $3 a barrel and you for $2.50, why don't we go all together and we'll form a consortium that says there'll be one price for any oil coming out of Saudi Arabia. And at the time, our politics did not, we were going to try to become energy independent, and the Saudis had already started getting all this money from worldwide, becoming a very rich nation. So we had what was called a oil embargo. The Persian Gulf stopped shipping us oil, and we ran out of gasoline. During the early 70s, under Carter, we had this terrible fuel shortage. People had to line their cars up to get gasoline. It impacted everything. Interest rates, and I want to talk about that because it's really important. Interest rate in 1970 on home mortgages was 8.5%. If you were going to buy a house, you had to pay 8.5% for it. In 1980, it's 12%. That's what was the Helm interest rates. So it meant if you borrowed money for anything, you were paying lots and lots of interest, which tends to drag the economy down. And you do have, and it was in the late 70s, and I'm getting into that era now, late 70s and into early 80s, you had a recession in 1980s, yeah, about that. There was a recession, the economy shrunk. Carter had reduced federal spending on government stuff. There was, an effort to reduce that. We had ramped up and spent so much money on Vietnam. Now it's time to ramp it down, and very little attention paid to the Cold War and what the Russians were doing. We sort of stabilized that. They were building nukes. We were building nukes. That was all going on. Carter fumbled and stumbled his way through his one term. And we had oil crisis, we had high inflation, we had recession, economics were not good. So starting in, Reagan is elected after Carter. Yeah, Reagan comes in. He's a Republican, and you can see, and one thing I want to point out is the flipping and flopping of who the presidents are. Democrats, Republicans. Eisenhower, Republican after World War II. And then we had Kennedy, a Democrat, back on caring for the people, not so much he had foreign policy called the Cold War. And then, he was Johnson, Democrat, and a social liberal who wants to improve the standards of all Americans by Medicare with him. And then Johnson, the Vietnam War destroys Johnson. He doesn't even run for another term. And Nixon, a Republican, come back in to save the day. We're going to end the war, and we're going to figure out how better we're going to engage the Chinese, because world trade's a good idea, and we can get a lot of cheap stuff out of China if they'll only allow it. We could start a good trade partner there. And Nixon, he has to resign because he's a crook. That's what everybody, Nixon the crook. He resigns, and Ford, who's vice president, hardly of any consequence, he's a caretaker, ends out Nixon's term, runs, but he's already tainted himself. He pardoned Nixon. There's just a lot of people didn't like that at all, and other policies were going on. So Carter comes in as a Democratic governor. He was at least a governor of a state, so he knew something about governing, but he was way over his head when it came to the federal government, way over his head, and he bumbled and stumbled pretty badly. only served one term. And now we have America. Crazy. We have Ronald Reagan come in, who was actually an actor. Now, he had been governor of California, so he had some governing experience. But here we have, he was really an actor who had become governor of California. He came in and he was a Republican, and one of the major issues for him when he came in office, which was in 1970, whatever, I don't remember, 80. Um, um, yeah, yeah, was the Cold War. He was a hard dyed-in-the-wool anti-communist. The Russians were back on the Cold War with the Russians, and he he Berlin had been divided east and west. I told you about that, and he started ramping up defense spending again. It's my view, and it'll stretch even farther into the 80s, 70s, and 80s. As he ramped up military production, and we had like an arms race between us and the Soviet Union. And I think we basically bankrupt the communists. We borrowed so much money, the Americans did, and we started putting tons of money in defense. There was a ramp up of that. And we were making miniaturized nuclear weapons the size of golf balls. I don't know. If we could do it, we would. And the Navy, we expanded the submarine fleet. And there had been improvements once upon a time. The Navy didn't want to be left out of strategic nuclear war, so they had retrofitted and been installing nuclear weapons, missiles in their submarines. And they had their own program for development of nuclear stuff. And they became more of a factor. Submarines were hard to locate. We already had our land-based ICBMs, B-52s flying all the time. But we began spending big money on ramping up our military, improving our military. Well, the Soviet Union at the time had no choice but do the same thing. They were already on rocky economic. They did not do a lot of exporting around the world. They were a big source of diamond. The Soviet Union had a lot of natural resources, including oil, and they did export those sorts of things, but they were not you didn't find things stamped made in Russia on them. They didn't make a lot of products for export. They were still heavily centrally controlled during that period. The government owned literally all the factories. The economics of most of the people in Russia was not good. There was no free enterprise, if you will. So we began spending tons and tons of money on ramping up our strategic nuclear weapons. There was not a lot of bluster going on between Reagan and I've forgotten who. There were 3 or 4 presidents had come and gone in Russia. Some were very, very belligerent, and some were not. Anyway, we spent money, they spent money. They didn't have a good economic base to start with, and what happened in the end was the Soviet Union fractured. I think Reagan in the 70s, 80s wound up bankrupting, if you will, what was known at the time as the Soviet Union. They just not economically go ahead. All of the satellite countries from Ukraine to Poland to Czechoslovakia, they're all now lobbying and wanting to become their own countries again. They gotten tired of this control by Moscow of what they did or didn't do, and the Russians, the central government realized they could not continue with the same program that they had where they controlled everything. And so they began to loosen up. And then over a period of time, the Soviet Socialist Republic broke apart. and where Poland became an own country again, and Czechoslovakia and Lithuania, and they all became their own countries. Some had communist leadership. Some had more democratically elected presidents. It took a while, but Reagan caused the fracturing and destruction of the Soviet Socialist USSR. It broke apart because of that. And I always say, yeah, we put us in big debt doing all this defense spending. But it was better than exchanging nukes between the Soviet Union and America. Strategic nuclear war, it was better than doing that. So it took a big hit on our economy. Interest rates were high. That meant less houses were being built. It cost more money to build cars. It was not a good economic period in the 80s in the United States overall because interest rates so hard. I tried to look it up and I don't know exactly, but credit cards did not come into being until it must have been the late 70s or early 80s. Before that, everything was done by check or cash. Checks have been around forever and ever. But credit cards were new to the scene, and the companies who started a credit card business were shipping free credit cards. You get them in the mail all the time. Well, all you need to do is sign the back of it, you can use it. That was common. You could get 3 or 4 credit card offers in the mail every day. Credit card use initially would start off slowly, but then ramped up. People got seeing the advantage of you could buy now and pay later. You no longer had to go to bank to get a $300 loan to buy a new washing machine. You could put on your credit card. That changed. Consumerism began to grow again, and I'm going to finish up on the 70s and 80s by saying you're now seeing trade pick up from China and other parts of the world, supplying low-cost goods in that Americans can buy with a credit card. You don't have to go to the bank anymore. You don't have to finance that washing machine or whatever, some high interest rate through Sears or wherever you buy it. You don't have to do it like through them anymore. You can just take a piece of plastic out of your billfold and use that. Everybody has a readily available personal loan at their disposal at a very high interest rate. And it didn't take long for credit cards to catch on. Okay, I pretty much tried to cover the 70s and somewhat the 80s. It started in the late 60s, which is really important. There was a fracturing of the culture. There were enough people living in the United States that you could form groups of anything. You're interested in bowling, you got bowling groups. If you're interested in a new political party, you could form one. If you wanted an agricultural farm bureau to lobby for particular rights, you could do that. There was a fracturing, and underneath of it all, there was some disrespect, some loss of faith in the federal government because of the war and because of the crook, Richard Nixon. And that the government didn't always tell the truth. They'd skew things depending on who was in power. Okay? That fracturing affected everything down. Men got along early in the late 1960s. If you lived in California and a man had long hair, if you went to Mississippi, you're liable to have your head shorn. It was the same sort of concept that was happening if you were black or you were gay. If it was okay in your area, but you moved someplace else, and when it wasn't fully accepted yet. Same way with marijuana. I had gone to Korea in the 1970s. I was in the U.S. Army. Vietnam was winding down in the early 1970s. We were withdrawing troops. So the military and the drafts and all that stuff began to wind down. But I had gone to a military college and I was in the Army. So I was sent to South Korea. At that time, North Korea was rumbling and thinking about invading the South. And our fear was that we're already fighting in Vietnam. We would not be able to fight a second war at the same time in Korea. So I was sent there to keep the North Koreans up there, I'd shoot down their aircraft. Okay. When I went to South Korea, it's the first time I saw marijuana, and they were growing it. It had been present in Vietnam as well as other drugs in Vietnam, from heroin, opium, all those things that were already in the Southeast in Asia. Had been there for a long time. Americans, it was sold to and used by Americans, and they liked it. Okay. So when they came back marijuana became, and psychedelics and the whole drug business appeared at the end of the 70s and well into the 80s. Marijuana, of course, it was illegal, but there weren't enough police in the world to track down all the marijuana that was going on. So first marijuana I saw, or cocaine, or heroin, stuff, was in the early 1970s. When I came back from South Korea, the world had completely changed in America. Now marijuana was everywhere. I'd never even known it, never seen it up till then. But now I'll come back and somehow it hopped. And it was all those returning soldiers from Vietnam. It hopped over. Marijuana is everywhere. There is a counterculture, well-established people are openly talking about how they don't like the government doing this or doing that. There is dissent all the time about one political policy or another. The civil rights movement had not ended. It was still being pushing and pushing and pushing. So that was all economic, social, political turmoil through that period. And again, remember, the population is growing. Baby boomers, the children of the baby boomers after World War II. Okay, the 80s, it's got Reagan in there, and he's a staunch conservative. He's going to, and economically, it was not a good time, and we had a recession. The recessions come and go. You overbuild. They build too many office buildings. They build too many houses. Nobody can buy them, so it drops out. They have to lay off people, and then bad cycle. The government tried to control that, but anyway, this is the 70s and sort of 80s run together. And during that period, I graduated from college in 1969. I went to work for 1 year for an electronics events contractor. I got married, which was common, and I'll make that a cultural point. You went to high school, and next thing you did, it's like a railroad track. You went to high school, and next thing you did was typically get a job, and then you got married, and then you started having babies. Bop, 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 railroad track down the line. You get a job, you get married, you start babies, you get a house, you had a car. That was the American dream. That was still the norm. And you think about it, it's a norm because it goes way back to tribalism. You form couples and have babies for the continuation of the species, for the continuation of the benefit of the tribe, the people living around you. So that was the truth in my case. When I graduated in 1969, I don't know how many weddings occurred a day or two after graduation. It was a lot. You waited until you graduated, and I mean the next day you were married. Literally. That was clickety-clack down the track. Graduated, married, you may have served military service. Next thing was get that good high-paying job that the government talks about, and then you buy yourself a house. And you get your color TV, and you get a nice car, and you live the good life, and you get a swimming pool, and you have TV dinners by the pool, because things are good. That was what was occurring with me. And so in the 70s and 80s, I was a house purchaser. We had more children. I had all the associated stuff with having children. We needed to buy more products. The baby boomers drove an economic boom, in terms of everything from furniture to cars to houses to because there were so many of us. And that was a driving force at the time. So this is sort of the 70s and 80s rolled together. There's always a lot of politics. The federal government's always in play. They're deciding big issues. The world is always in play because somebody's doing something over there we don't like. The oil, OPEC became into being during that period, which is a cartel of oil companies who set the price of oil. And they're still in existence. Drug trade started big time out of Colombia, South America. Cocaine for the richest people up in New York, marijuana for the rest of us. That all started in the 70s and 80s. It had been going on a little bit before, but it certainly hit the big time during that period. And you have drug dealers that you know that you can go to. Somebody got a sideline selling marijuana by the ounce. Um, Credit cards came into being. Still no internet, but credit cards and color television. Everybody's got color TVs now. And there is some, not yet, but there is cable TV beginning to infiltrate everything. So now you have 50 channels of crap as opposed. Cable TV began to string through in the 70s and 80s. It took a longer time than that to get in the outland, but certainly in the major population cities, cable TV came into being, and you could subscribe and get multiple channels, which spread, which expanded your cultural awareness. You got to remember, you live in a small town, you only know what's there, but now if you can have access to the media, you see stories from California or here and there, it impacts your understanding that there are other ways of living. There are other groups who got really long hair and smoke joints, them damn hippies, you know. They're Woodstock, the big Woodstock music festival occurred, you know, during that period of time. All these young people got to bear, it scared a lot of people. All these young hippie weirdo people that run around without bras on. They're burning the bras. They're burning the draft cards. They're wearing long hair. Women are got skimpy dresses on. They're all smoking wacky weed, you know. It's bad, weird time. Anyway, that's enough. It's the 70s and 80s, and a lot of 60s, because 60s were really important, late 60s. Fracturalization of the monolithic socioeconomic America occurred in the late 1960s with all this protesting against the war, all the civil rights movement that was going on. It fractured faith in the American government, the American system of federal government and state government. There was a loss of faith in that and their credibility, which is never coming back again. Uncle Rana stuff. This is America 1970s and 1980s with a lead in. And again, it's an artificial period. You can chop things and slice and dice it however you want. It'd be maybe better to take a 5-year period because a lot of stuff happens even in a 2-year period. A 3-year, a 10-year period is a lot happens in that period. And it doesn't automatically start and end just because the calendar switched over to another decade. 10 years back. Uncle Ron's stuff today is the 6th of June, 2024, and this should take care of the 70s and 80s. Uncle Ron's stuff, bye-bye.